Our final topic, this last theme, is of course economics, ethics, values. I was on a call this morning. I think I've mentioned to you this process that the World Economic Forum has called a moral economy dialogue that Jack DeGioia and I are chairing. And we had a call this morning, one of those sort of what are we going to do calls with, computers and people's faces from around the world, a really high-tech operation. And the only thing that I remember from the call of any import was a statement made by a new person on the call who's working in corporate ethics. And he said this: "We have vastly underestimated the importance of values in our economic decision-making." And I thought, what a vastly understated comment that is. We have vastly underestimated the importance of values in our decision-making. Now, we all, I think, loved Elizabeth Warren last week. What I remember especially was how usury laws were in effect from the Code of Hammurabi in 450 to the 1980s. It was a great sort of time frame when they all got taken away by people who had an interest in doing so. So you might ask, who are the true conservatives in this conversation? Today, the lecture that I was planning to give was drawn right from the Recovering Values book, which you now in the last 2 weeks have read. But in reading your reflections on those readings, I concluded that you got it, that you get it. And the reflections were very honed and personal, in particular about consumerism, which you almost all dealt with, which I would call the drug of an unjust society that is meant to numb our minds, dull our conscience, and distract our attention. It's a drug designed to numb and dull and distract. And indeed, we are addicted. I'm going to do a CNN interview this Friday on what's called Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, biggest shopping day of the year. And I heard an ad on the radio yesterday that says, "Get Black Friday going early. Right now, get online and start your Black Friday shopping right now." A pastor friend of mine in Cincinnati preached last year to his congregation, okay, Christmas, gifts, kids, relatives, I understand. Okay, I understand. So let's make this commitment. For every dollar you spend on a gift this year, give also $1 to the poor. And the most effective ministry you know that's really helping poor people escape their poverty. At least 1 to 1. I'm not saying don't give gifts, but every time you spend $1 on gifts for your kids or whoever, $1 more on the poor. I'm thinking that this year there will be a lot of pastors wrestling with those kinds of sermons. What to say about Black Friday and about Christmas and Hanukkah and all the rest. Because as we have been discussing this, what's at stake here, not just in this last section, but in all of our conversations, what's at stake here is not much really, just as your readings, as your reflections would suggest to me, the planet, the poor, and our souls. The planet, the poor, and our souls, all of which have religious implications and moral ones, whether you are or not a person of faith. So I thought this last week of the course that I would shift a bit and not do the topic per se, because the wrestling that I felt in the reflections, which actually seeming to me have gotten better and better and better as we've gone along. I said last week I loved last week's reflections, and this week I like them even better. Because you're dealing now with your own lives and your own choices and your own vocation. Now, let the truth be told. This is where I hoped you'd be after all these weeks. And this is why I spend my time teaching a course like this. You'd be surprised it isn't for the money or for my career. It's the chance to be with young leaders who are deciding their trajectory, their vocation. Because when you're in that space, I think you're on what we'd call holy ground. It's not finally about your grasping of the course material and you're producing a great final paper, which I know you all will, or even the final grade. My hope is that what you'll carry from this is what you can do, who you can be, and how you can make a difference to all the things that we have discussed. The Greek notion of education is you assimilate information, then at critical points spit it back, tests, exams, and metrics of various kinds. The more Hebrew notion of education is you don't know something really until it has changed your life in some way. You don't know it until it has altered your choices, your path, your trajectory. Otherwise, just all information. We've had a lot of information in this course, and you've done well with it, and I appreciate that. You'll present more to me in your paper and to each other, and I will have to give a metric to that. That's part of my job. But what's more important here than information is formation. Formation. And the issue of vocation is what I want to talk about today. It's about less the course information than about you and where you go from here. So, I hope we get here, and we have, and so this topic is about you. So I was in Minneapolis, and I was at a speaking event, signing books afterwards, and I looked up on the table, and I love the book signing table thing, because you get all these little personal conversations with people, very different kind of people. So I looked up, and here's a little girl who was next in line. I mean, little girl. So I said, "How old are you?" She said, "I'm 11. So I stopped the line. I said, "Now I want to know what you got from tonight and why you're standing here." She said, "Well, I think we're just going to have to change the world." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "And who's going to do that?" "People like me. People like me." So that was in Minneapolis. The next night I was in Tacoma, Washington, the next night, doing another of these book talks, and I told this story about the 11-year-old little girl. So sure enough, at the table, I look up, and here's even a younger-looking little girl. And I look up, and she just grins at me and says, 9! So I told both their stories in Seattle the next night. And sure enough, I look up from the table in Seattle, and here's the youngest-looking kid of all. And she says, I think I'm the youngest so far. I'm 8. So I had to find out why she was there. And so she says, well, when you talked about that silent tsunami, you called it, a silent tsunami, killing all the children, 30,000 children every day because of hunger and disease, you said it was like a silent tsunami. And I was just sitting there thinking, those are children like me. But I'm not dying, and they are. So I was just sitting there thinking, if I'm a Christian, I better do something about that. Now, I really love that because in that there are some very specific things these young women, young girls are realizing, that it is incumbent upon them to ask this question about not just how I fit into the world, but how I change it. And they all were talking about specific things. I says, what is your, and they all had something that was really getting to them. And they all connected it to their faith, whether Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or just moral sensibility. The best conversations I have these days, almost every week on the road, are with 14-year-olds who are asking how their lives and how their faith can make a difference in the world. I have that at home most nights with my 12-year-old. So I remember I was teaching at Harvard this course on that trip, and I came back to Harvard the next week and said, well, if you all want to help lead this kind of change, you better move quickly because a whole new generation coming in behind you, and they're going to push you out of the way. So that conversation is occurring. Now, one of the stories that I often tell at commencements, and I think I did at this one, I probably did a few years ago at Georgetown, because I almost always do, but I haven't shared it here. I got a letter one day in the mail, another speaking invitation or request, but this one was unusual. It came from prisoners at Sing Sing Prison in upstate New York. And it was, we hear that people who read your books, that sometimes you'll come and talk to them about the books. Well, we're all reading your book, and we'd like you to come and talk to us here at Sing Sing. So I wrote back, and I said, well, that sounds interesting. When would you like me to come? And this young brother writes back on behalf of his colleagues. He says, well, he said, we're free most nights. He said, we're kind of a captive audience here, and we worked out the details. And the prison authority, Sing Sing is this very famous maximum security prison. It's way up the Hudson. It's from where we get the phrase "up the river." You know that phrase? That's Sing Sing, up the river. So they worked it out, and I had 4 hours alone in a room with 80 guys down the bowels of Sing Sing one night. And I'll never forget that experience. One of them, a young guy, said to me, Jim, we're all from the whole prison here. We're all from just like 5 neighborhoods in New York City. Whole prison. Just about 5 neighborhoods. He said, it's like a train. It begins in neighborhoods like mine. You get on when you're 9 or 10 years old. And the train ends up here at Sing Sing. It's like a train. Powerful metaphor of what happens to young kids in only certain zip codes, or mostly. But this kid had had a conversion inside the walls, and they're actually, this program they were in, it's a New York Theological Seminary, has a Master of Divinity program inside the walls of Sing Sing. You can become a clergy person inside the walls of the prison, only program like in the country. And he said, but I've been converted, he said, and when I get back home, he said, I'm going to stop that train. I'm going to stop that train. 2 years later, I'm in New York City leading a town meeting on poverty. Guess who's up front? Back home, now trying to stop that train. The same kid. Then I got invited back for their commencement. They were graduating, seniors in that program. Only time in a commencement I had to go through a metal detector first. And these guys got out of their orange jumpsuits, and they got on their white shirts and ties and their suit jackets, at least Salvation Army, and there in the audience were their wives and kids and mothers and fathers. And they're graduating from Sing Sing prison. Some would go out when their sentences ended. Others would be now inside the prison system for the rest of their lives. And as soon as they graduate, the prison system finds them so valuable. They move them around to a number of prisons to play key roles as prisoners in those systems. And I said to them when I did their commencement that night, I said, you know, you guys are lucky in lots of ways because there's no illusions with you. You know what the world is like. You know what we're facing. You've been through it. You have been spit up and chewed up and spit out by it. And here you are looking this world straight in the eye and say, I'm going to go back and change that. There are no kind of youthful idealists there. There are no kind of naive people who are having their stint at social change. They understand what's at stake, and they want to change those realities. So I would suggest that each new generation, yours and ones that follow, have choices to make in two particular areas. First of all, you have to decide what is acceptable. So usually things that are horrible, that are terrible, that are wrong, that are grossly unjust, are accepted by most people for a long, long time. I'm reading a book called Bury the Chains and how 12 people got together, I think I mentioned this, in London in the early 1700s and said, we're going to end the slave trade. Foolish idea at that time. But things change when finally they're found to be unacceptable. What is acceptable? And usually takes a new generation to say, that which has been accepted for a long time, we are simply not going to accept. It is no longer acceptable. The second question is, what is possible? What is possible? Oh, well, that's bad, but it can't really be changed. I mean, it would be better if it wasn't there, if we didn't tolerate that, but really, it's impossible to do that. I mean, there are 3 billion people living on $2 a day and 1 billion living on $1 a day, and the gap between life expectancy in the rich places and the poor place in our world is now 40 years gap in life expectancy, which means death in our world is a social disease. Depends on where you're born. Whether HIV is something we can find a drug to sustain you on, or whether it's a death sentence. Some of you know public health better than I. and you know that's the truth. Death is a social disease all over the world, and we accept it, and we have easy explanations. Well, it's something to do with their fault somehow, those who are on the receiving end of the injustice. So what is acceptable and what is possible? I think the big battle, the big choice, the biggest struggle of our times is really the choice, and I think it's a choice, between cynicism and hope. That's the choice. The two kinds of people that really know the world best, are most realistic, usually are the cynics and the saints. Everyone else is kind of living in denial or distraction. But the cynics see the world as it is, and the saints do too. The only difference between them is a decision or a choice to live in hope, which is, I'm going to say to you, is not hope is not a feeling. It's not a personality type. It's not cup being half full or half empty. It's not a mood, for sure. The choice to hope is a decision you make. Not a mood, not a feeling, my wife is a cup half full person, I'm a cup half empty person. It's good, we're a good balance for that. But it's not about mood or feeling, it's about decision. And I'd say it's a decision you make because of this thing that we call faith. Now, whether your faith is religious or whether it is a moral sensibility or whatever it is that drives you at the deepest level, whatever you call faith, that's how we make this decision. The book of Hebrews says that faith is the substance, it says, of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, Hebrews chapter 11. My best paraphrase of that text is something like this. Hope means believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. Every time, that's how change has come. Believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. So, I have listened to you. I have read your reflections. I've talked to a number of you. And I want to say what they say about you is true. You are bright, you are gifted, and you are committed. And there are probably a lot of folks who say, you are full of potential. And they are right. You are. In that regard, I want to encourage you in this last lecture, each of you to think about your vocation more than your career. And there is a difference. From the outside, the two tracks may look very much alike, but asking the vocational question, rather than just considering your career options, will take you much deeper. The key is to ask why you might take one path instead of another. It's about choosing to do something for deeper reasons than merely because you can. You can. That's not enough. Or because your background has steered you in a certain direction. The key is to ask who you really are and what kind of person you want to become. It's to ask what you believe you're supposed to do with your life. I've often thought career is where you assemble your assets, and you put them in a resume. Then you choose a ladder of ascent, of success, a lot of career ladders, and you figure out which niche on which ladder best fits your assets, and you try to get on the highest rung possible to start with of that ladder. Now, my Harvard students figured they were from Harvard, so they get the fourth rung to start with, six-figure to start with. So which ladder in the market can your assets put you on at the highest rung? Vocation is not like that. Vocation is not about your assets or even your skills. It's really about your gifts. Now that's kind of a threatening term sometimes. What are my gifts? What do you mean my gifts? What are my gifts? Well, I would say things to look for are things like this. What do you lose track of time when you're doing? You just lose all track of time when you're doing this thing. What's that deep down gut stuff? You know, what are you most passionate about? What really gets you going? What gets your juices flowing? What do you really get all agitated about? What are you really good at? I mean, really good at. And what do you think you probably were supposed to do in this world? What are those gifts? You do have great potential, but that potential will be most fulfilled if you follow the leanings, I would say, of conscience and the language of the heart, more than just the dictates of the market, be it economic, political, or professional. Those in power want our smartest young people just to manage the systems of the world. They want you, and Georgetown and Harvard get a disproportionate number of managers. I say, what a waste of real talent just to manage these systems as we have them. Rather than merely fitting into the systems, ask how you can change them. I think you're smart enough and talented enough to do that. That's what I mean by potential. So here's the vocation question. Where are your gifts, once you've figured out what they are, where your gifts intersect with the crushing needs of the world, right at that point, that's your vocation. Where your gifts intersect with the crushing needs of the world, and we've dealt with many of them this semester. Right there, at that place, is your vocation. Now, the antidote to cynicism is not optimism. That's shallow. But action. And action's always born out of hope. Like that little girl at 11, we really have to believe as adults now that we indeed can change the world. Every change has come, every single one, by a critical mass of people deciding that this thing can be changed before anybody else thought it could be. So if you track how change starts over here, it's back here when a little group of people decided that thing was no longer acceptable and it was possible to change it. And that belief is what made the change happen. And one more thing, betting your life on what you say you believe. That's what makes that change happen. So to me, this is not idealistic so much as it's just how history works. It's the practical outworking of how history finally makes change. Now, I want to also say, as you know from what I've tried to say in this class and what the guest lectures have in your readings suggest, that there's a connection vital here between, I would call it spirituality, whatever you mean by that, and social justice. Because in affluent societies like ours, spirituality can easily become a kind of a narcissistic, almost commodity. You know, there are whole shelves of books at Barnes and Noble about being whole and prosperous and balanced and happy, and there's gurus and weekends and you know, all costing a lot of money, but it's worth it. You know, you're worth it. There's that kind of whole commodification of spirituality. And I would say in an affluent society that the quest for spirituality, not rooted in the struggle for justice, is easily co-opted. At the same time, the battle for justice and fighting for change that's not rooted in some deeply spiritual place can easily become a path of burnout and despair and anger and even violence, which we've seen. So, how to nourish that struggle for justice with the spiritual practices and resources that an activist needs without, or else you'll be drawn to exhaustion. So it's one way of saying, to be an activist for a long time, you better learn how to be a contemplative as well. So let me just tell you a final story, and then we'll open this up. I learned a lot of my, let me call it, theology of hope from South Africa. I became engaged in that struggle a long time ago, before there was any hope on the horizon. And it was people like Desmond Tutu who really were my teachers about this theology of hope. And I remember the first time that I went, I was invited to come by the church leaders because they were suffering a lot of persecution, and they wanted to create a strategy that finally was the sanction strategy that led to the downfall of apartheid. But it hadn't been done yet, and they reached out and said, please come to South Africa and help us to do this. It had to be an American South African strategy. So I wanted to go, but I couldn't because my name was on all the security lists for the South African government, so I couldn't get in. And so I was just last week with the World Vision person who had me snuck in the country. World Vision snuck me into the country past all the security clearances and checkpoints. So the day I arrived, I was to meet Desmond Tutu because he could meet me at the airport, because that would have given everything away. I had to get to his cathedral in Cape Town, which I did. And the scene was very dramatic. There was, they had just called for, it was a rally supposed to happen in the cathedral, and the police had just canceled the rally. You can't have it. So Bishop Tutu says, okay, then we're going to just have church. And so they didn't want to cancel church, the government, so they just kind of let that go on. And so inside, and I arrived just at this moment, inside the cathedral, here's a little, not a big place, a relatively small cathedral. Here's this throng of worshipers huddled together. And outside, there were literally 3 times as many police and military personnel, all riot gear, automatic weapons, gas masks, the whole thing. 3 times as many of them as us. And they surrounded this cathedral, and their intention was to make us afraid. And with me, at least, it was working pretty well. I mean, they were very daunting out there. Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Tutu, was getting up to preach, and he began his sermon, and just as he did, they actually broke down the door in the back of the cathedral. They're called the South African Security Police, and these guys are thugs. Most have necks as big as my legs, and they're just huge guys. And I've actually been interrogated by the South African Security Police, and they are indeed thugs. And they line the walls of his cathedral, and they had in their hands tape recorders and pads of paper, as if to say, "Go ahead, Bishop. You be prophetic, you be bold, you be, we had you in jail just a few weeks ago, and we'll get down what you say, and we'll put you right back in jail." They were there to send a message to him and all of us, which was this: we own this country. We white Afrikaners own this country. We masters of apartheid, we own this country. Pretoria owns this country. We own this country. We own you. We own this place. We own your religion. And by the way, we own your God. We own it all. That was the message. Desmond Tutu stopped talking, and he stood there and just bowed his head as if in prayer. It was a very dramatic moment, and we just were sitting there in the congregation wondering what he would say, what he would do. And he looked up, and doesn't he remind you of Yoda? He just looks like Yoda, little man, long flowing robes. And he looked up, and he just gazed at these security police. He said, "You are powerful. You are indeed very powerful. But you are not gods, and I serve a God who will not be mocked." Then he smiled, that Desmond Tutu smile, if you've ever seen that. He has this just one of the best smiles in the world, better than Magic Johnson. It was a great smile. And then he smiled, and he started laughing at them. Now, politely, he's a bishop, of course. But he said, "So, ha ha ha, since you have already lost, then he began bouncing like a good black Baptist preacher, "we invite you today to come and join the winning side." And when he said that, the place erupted, and young people began dancing, this dance called the Toi Toi. It's a South African dance, kind of a chanting, stomping dance. And they danced us outside, and the police and military just moved back. They didn't expect dancing worshipers, right? So we're dancing in the streets of South Africa, surrounded by all of the firepower of apartheid. 10 years later, I was blessed to be at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. And guess who was master of ceremonies? Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I ran up to him, I said, "Bishop, do you remember that day at St. George's in your cathedral? You remember what you said? Remember what we did?" And he smiled, big smile. He remembered. I said, "Bishop, today they've all joined the winning side. They've all joined the winning side, because there wasn't one white South African that day who hadn't always been against apartheid. They'd all joined the winning side." 150,000 of us standing, listening to Nelson Mandela announce the birth of a new nation. Tears running down our cheeks, and then there was this noise, distant noise, and we all looked up, and we looked out, way down the horizon was helicopters, and they were getting closer, and then behind them there were jet planes, and we saw the Air Force coming our direction. And literally 150,000 people cowered like this because they were afraid of what might happen now. And we're all thinking, no, they couldn't do this. They couldn't end this all now. They couldn't do that, could they? And I remember being in that crowd with my friends and just cowering and looking up. And then I saw the planes released their fuel in the colors and the shape of the new South African flag. The white guys were there to pay tribute to the new president of South Africa. Now, what I learned from that is this. Here's how change comes. Faith that prompts hope, that creates action and causes change. Faith, hope, action, and change. And when the change comes, when I call it the party, you have the party, the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, the party's great. And to be there is wonderful. And for people of faith, to be the party is a great thing. It's a great celebration. But that's not where we're needed at the party. We're needed back at St. George's in the cathedral when you're surrounded by those who say it'll never change. And we're the ones who have to see the party before anybody else can see it. We're the ones who see the party through the eyes of faith. That's the whole point of faith. To see the party before anybody else can see it. And then to live your life to make the party happen. Faith, hope, action, and change. My theology of hope. You probably heard this from Obama. It kind of got made into a campaign slogan. But I knew the woman who came up with it. Actually, she took it from Sweet Honey in the Rock. Lisa Sullivan was the best street organizer in this city I ever knew. She was with street kids, the toughest kids. She was the best. She was on the streets. She was from the streets and went and got a PhD at Yale and came back to work the streets. She could have any corporate job, anything. She came back and she was the best street organizer. She was on my board. She was a dear friend of mine, and she was in the group that I was in with the then State Senator Barack Obama a long time ago. So he knew Lisa too. And Lisa would get mad when people would say, this is too big for us. It can't change. It won't change. And we don't have any Martin Luther King Jr.'s anymore. It's too big, and we don't have any leaders anymore. Whenever she would hear that, she'd get very angry, and she would say, every time, she said, stop it. Stop talking like that. Don't you understand? She said, we are the ones that we have been waiting for. That wasn't something David Axelrod thought up. Lisa would say, we are the ones we have been waiting for. It became this campaign thing, and now it's kind of, joked about. But it wasn't for Lisa, because she was a street organizer. I think Lisa's words are kind of a commission. Probably not typical to give commissions to classes at Georgetown, but I'm going to risk that. That Lisa's mantra, Lisa died at 43 of a heart ailment. Marion Wright Ailman and I, at her grave, just held each other and wept because Lisa was the future. But she lives on in that mantra, and it's a commission that I often use when I'm on the road with younger people, that we are the ones, you are the ones that we've been waiting for. And I'll close just with this. There's a Victorian poem that Mandela cites as what kept him going in prison. And if you saw the movie Invictus, they mentioned this poem in that movie. But it's a Victorian poem that he cites as what kept him going. And if it kept him going, I think it's worth repeating and finishing with. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried out loud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloodied, but not bowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll, but I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Worth remembering. So I want to thank you for this class and for the chance to have these conversations in this very wonderful academic environment. Thank you very much.